In this tutorial, we are going to be looking into the routing of Next.js. It is the first big feature we are going to be looking into for our next year for beginners course. Hello guys, I'm Oliver. I'll be going over this tutorial. If you're new to the channel, make sure you check my other tutorial as well. It's on my YouTube. For this tutorial, all the links and resources will be down below. So GitHub and all the other easy to access resources. I also have a Discord server. So if you are interested in talking to all the other students as well, go ahead and join the Discord server as well. So let's jump into the routing. I think this is going to be a really fun one. I have my GitHub repo right here. I created a new branch called routing. So all the routing example will be living into that. So the link down below. So go ahead, check it out. So routing, what is it? Why is such a big deal in Next.js? Okay. So this is actually a big deal. To be honest, Next.js introduced new way to route things. They used to use something called a page router. Right now, they changed that into app router. So what's the big difference between page router and app router? So page router used to be a client component, like a client heavy router based file system. So what that means that everything inside a page router was basically a client sided rendered page. But in the app router, they changed that into a server component. So everything inside is a server-centric file by design. So what that means? So let's recap this, okay? A file system-based router built on top of server component, which is the new component they added on the Next 13.4 that support a lot of this cool stuff, layout, nested routing, loading state, error handling, and more. So let's look into the code and see what's really happening. So this is basically a server component. So every time you create a file, create a page, is going to be server component. So what that means is if I do a console log in here, server components, and let's start the server as well. And this is the page, so it's hitting this index page. And notice what happened. The console log is being logged on the server. This is our terminal server, so it's been logged in here. Let's go back and open a console log in here. It's not console login in here. Let's refresh the page. There's no console log in here saying it's a server component. It is happening on the server. So that means by default, this page is rendered on the server. That's the beauty of Next.js new feature, the app router. So the routing is basically happening on the server component. If I create a new page, it will be happening on the server as well. So if what happens if we want to change it into a client, we want the browser to render the page. In that case, we have to change this into something called use client. We are going to be looking into this in more details. So notice when I refresh the page, it's not console login in here, it's console log on the browser. So that means that shows us the proof that right now it turned into a client component. So this page rendered on the browser instead of the server. So that's the beauty of Next.js. Is by default is server designed. Now we are not going to be talking about the render side of things. I just give you an example. We are going to be diving more deeper of the rendering side of things when we decide the rendering tutorial, which is going to be the next tutorial. For this one, we're going to be talking about the routing. So routing is basically how it is structured. The skeleton of our application is basically routing. So it's like a fundamental concept of, going to different route, showing different pages, how Next.js decided to show the different pages. So this is it. In the app, everything is basically the router we are talking about. So every file you create is going to be inside this app folder. And everything right here, like for example, let's create a file called dashboard And inside the file, we create something called page.jsx. And I'll create a, let's say, dashboard. This is a dashboard. So what happens is when I go to our index is the page here. If we want to go to the dashboard page, we have to go to localhost/dashboard. So that's the route we are trying to see. So see now is showing us the dashboard page, which is right here. So there's a few conventions that you need to go with. Every time you want to go to a route, you have to create a folder. So this folder means you're going to the dashboard route. But in order to show the UI of that folder, you have to create a page.jsx. So when you hit the folder route, the UI going to be shown using the page.js. This is associated with this route here. The page.js is going to be associated with this route. So every route going to have a page.js to show you the UI. So this is the UI we're showing using the page.jsx. And you can also do some nested routing. So let's say you create, in the dashboard, you create a folder called setting. And inside the setting, you create another page.jsx, which is going to be our setting UI. So I'm going to create a setting in here. And let's go to dashboard/setting. This is a nested route. So that means we are going inside the setting. We are hitting the dashboard and then we go to setting. If you take out the setting, we are going to be back to the dashboard. Now there's also a lot of cool things happening behind the scene. Since we are talking about the nested route, if you create something called a layout, the JSX, it will, let's create a dashboard layout. And in here, we pass in the children. And in here, we take in the children. So the layout is going to be for all the route inside the dashboard. So if you go to the setting in here, we also going to be seeing that layout. So dashboard layout. So cool part about this rendering thing is the layout is basically cache. So that's a really nice feature that comes behind the scene. So if you are going back and forth between setting and dashboard, this layout will be cached and it won't refresh. Only thing going to refresh will be the page element. So that helps you improve the performance of your application, I think, which is really cool that they consider that. Same thing with the root layout as well. It's pretty much cache, so you don't have that, you know, like it's not going to refresh. It's just this part that's going to refresh the inner content. So let's talk about some file convention and the special file that Next.js comes with. Like I told you in the first lesson, that Next.js is really well known for optimizing it further and further. They keep on optimizing that you don't have to do a lot of stuff behind the scene. Like that's been done for you. And one of the part here is that they have some file convention, special file, if you will, that works behind the scene for you. One such thing is something called a loading.jsx, a loading.js, whatever TS, whatever file you want to use. So loading is basically going to help you do something called React Suspense. So it's been cached right now, so I'm not sure you will be able to see it, but it's very small. Like it's so lightweight right now, our application, that you won't be able to see the effect of the loading file. It's basically React Suspense by default is being delivered for you. And I have like a React Suspense open, so I'm going to show you exactly what's going to happen. So what happened is, like, if you're familiar with React Suspense, this loading is basically a React Suspense that's been wrapped around your route in here. So dashboard route, they have a loading, which is a React Suspense behind the scene. It's been wrapped on this route here. So what that means is, if I try to fetch some big data on a dashboard, and if it's some part of it is not loading, it will show me the loading. So let's say if I click on this, it will show this loading state. And once the data has been fetched, it will fetch the data. So this suspense is been wrapped around our internal route UI pages. So is invisibly being wrapped around here. So you are not seeing this, but Next.js configured for you automatically. So in the future, if you build a big project, if you fetch some data, this will be automatically done for you just by creating a loading file here. So this is the behind the scene behavior that is happening. They also have something called error boundary. So error boundary is this right here. We can opt into it by creating something called error.jsx. You can also do like a not found JSX, which behind the scene they are using error boundary. So error.js and not found.js are using error boundary by default. So not found and error right here is error. So once we have these two created, the error is going to be like this. We have our use client, and the not found is going to be like this. This is basically going to be like the error boundary in here. It's going to wrap this into our component. So what happens? Let's see what happens if we go to the dashboard. It's all good. Let's throw an error in here. Let's say throw new error occurred. So settings is having some error for some reason. And if you go to the setting, let's change the error boundary message a little bit. Error happen. Let's see right here. Question mark, question mark. So it's a little bit noticeable. So if we go to the setting, it says error happen. So this component load instead of our page component. So this wasn't able to load because there was an error, and the Next.js was like, okay, we know what to do. There's an error boundary, so we're gonna show the error in here, and they just loaded up the error boundary component here, which is coming from this file, and you also have an error in here. So that's it. That's how Next.js does the thing, and it's really cool to see how it came about. Really easy to use as well. So yeah, these are a couple of things you want to keep in mind. So loading, so you have suspense, which is pretty useful, error, and not found. Next thing we're going to be looking at is the hierarchy at which it is rendered. So what is rendered first? So first you have the layout that's going to be rendering. Then you have template.js. We're not going to be using template.js. It's basically like a template file. So after that, the error happens. After the error, the loading happens. If there's none of these, then not found happen. If there's none of these, we render the page. So that's how it's been wrapped around the component. So there's a cool diagram on the Next.js in here, so we can just look into that. So you see layout is the first parent, template, error boundary, suspense. There's another error boundary which is not found, and then the page load up. So if none of these hits, the page will always load up, which is really nice to see. Like you always have like a backup, application. Like if you never created this file, this won't be there. So it's really cool to like how you can design certain things. Next, we're going to be looking at is something called colocation. So colocation is basically you can have your test file, your component, your style in your own file, and it's not going to be interfere with the routing. So for example, in the setting, let's create a button.js component. And here we call it button. I say click. So if you go to the setting, it's not appearing. So the button is not appearing. So yeah, just to get rid of this error. And if you go to the button, there's nothing as button. So this is not a route. Only the page is the UI that correspond to the route. The button is basically a component, and you have a co-location. That means you can locate other files inside this route, and it's not going to be interfering with the route. So we can go to the page and bring in the button component from our component folder here, and it's calling us click in here, and it's basically taking in the component and showing up in here, which is pretty cool. You can also keep your style file in here, you can keep your test file in here, and it's not going to be routable. Only the page is routable. So this is going to be routable, this is going to be routable. Other are just helping file. So we have everything down. This is basically how you create pages. If you want to create a sign-in pages, you create a sign-in folder, and then inside you create a page. You create a page of the sign-in UI. So that's how you go about things. So for example, if you create an about page, we can do about, and inside that we can create the about page JSX, and here about. And if you go to the about in here, we are in the about page. So that's basically how you create things, and then you can add those other things into the mix to everything. So once you have that understood, next thing I'm going to be talking about is something called server-centric routing with some client-side navigation. So if you are coming from the previous version of Next.js, so Next.js anywhere before 13.4, we used to have something called page router. Inside the page router, it was all client-side component. We used to navigate using link, and if you go from one page to the other, there's like a client-side navigation happening using the link behind the scene. So what changed now since we have a server component? So right now, Next.js decided to do everything server-centric. So by default, everything is a server component. So how does that plays out? So just like the route navigation, you still have some client-side navigation. So that means even if these are server-side rendered and server component, when you go back and forth between this, it also is still retaining the client-side navigation. That means they use something called link component to kind of resemble the single page application. So it's super fast. You can navigate between the CVC. The navbar stays and it doesn't move. The footer also stays. It's just the middle part that moves. So we still are using that single page application behavior using the link component with the server-sided rendering. So you have the client-side navigation still retaining on this new version. You also have something called in-memory client-side cache, which is also retained in this new version. What that means? So caching is basically you store some data, you store some segmentation of the data, and if you're like going to different pages, the Next.js will retain some of the cache segment of the reusable data. So we have a more better performance when it comes to loading times. So you have those two features that's retained on the server component, even though things change from page router to app router. Page router used to have client-centric design, app router have server-centric design. You still retain some client-sided feature, which is really nice to have because it improves your overall performance. So once you have those advanced concepts down, there's also one thing I like to add in here. Like in the data fetching, we are definitely going to cover, but since we're talking about the routing, we also have something called an API folder in the app. And in the API is everything going to be server in here. So in the API, you are going to be calling a route, and this route is going to be handling the API. We are going to be diving deeper on the feature lesson for this. For now, I think this is enough. You can also separate your routing and the API by creating a parenthesis and create something called site. And inside the site, you can put your dashboard and everything in here. You kind of like, have the API in one folder and your site in one folder, so you can differentiate between this. So yeah, right now, if I go to site, so this file name is not going to be routable. So the about will still work because this is just a folder that rearrange the structure a little bit. This helps you give you some space. So this is not a routable folder. Only everything inside is routable. So that means you're still hitting the about page as is. It's kind of like arrange things a little better. So in the next lesson, we are going to be covering more about rendering. And in that, we're going to go over a lot more deep dive into how things render. But for now, routing, you guys should have a strong understanding of the routing. And yeah, see you on the next lesson. Make sure you smash that like button, subscribe to my channel, and also grab that free Next.js guide that I'm giving away. it have all the diagram and all the information in more depth for your learning experience. So see you on the next lesson.